For decades, Cliff Richard was a living legend, the golden boy of British pop music, the man whose voice defined an entire generation. From sold-out stadiums to chart-topping hits, he was unstoppable. His clean-cut image, infectious charm, and timeless songs made him one of the most adored performers in the world. But then, almost without warning, Cliff Richard vanished from the spotlight. No more tours, no more public appearances. It was as if the man who had once ruled the airwaves had simply disappeared. Fans were left heartbroken and confused. How could someone who lived for the stage just walk away from it all? Rumors swirled for years. Stories of exhaustion, heartbreak, betrayal, and even scandal. Some claimed he had grown tired of the constant scrutiny. Others whispered that Hollywood's dark side had finally caught up to him. But the truth behind Cliff Richard's disappearance is far more emotional and personal than most people realize. Behind the fame and fortune was a man who had been quietly fighting battles no one saw, battles that left scars deeper than any headline could ever reveal. Those close to him say the weight of public pressure, the loneliness of stardom, and years of unfair accusations took a devastating toll. Now, after years of silence, those closest to Cliff are speaking out, revealing the painful truth about what really happened to him, why he stepped away, and how he spent his life since leaving the spotlight. What emerges is a story of heartbreak, faith, and resilience, one that reminds us that even the brightest stars can burn out when the world becomes too heavy to bear. Before his disappearance from the spotlight, Cliff Richard was a symbol of hope, joy, and timeless music. Born Harry Roger Webb in Lucknow, India, in 1940, he moved to England with his family after World War II, never imagining that his voice would one day change the face of British pop forever. When he emerged in the late 1950s, the world was in desperate need of something new, a sound that could bridge the gap between traditional crooners and the explosive energy of rock and roll. Cliff became that bridge. With his slicked-back hair, infectious smile, and effortless charisma, Cliff Richard was quickly dubbed the British Elvis. His early hits like Move It, Living Doll, and Bachelor Boy didn't just top charts, they helped define an era. He wasn't wild or rebellious like his American counterparts. Instead, Cliff represented a more wholesome kind of fame. Parents loved him, teenagers adored him, and soon he became a household name not just in Britain, but around the world. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, Cliff's career only grew stronger. He transitioned seamlessly from rock and roll to softer pop and even gospel-inspired music, showing a versatility that few artists could match. Songs like Congratulations and We Don't Talk Anymore became instant classics, earning him a permanent spot in the hearts of millions. By the time he entered his 40s, Cliff had sold over 250 million records, a staggering achievement that placed him among the world's most successful entertainers. But while his public image was that of perfection, polite, devout, and scandal-free, the truth behind the curtain was far more complicated. The constant pressure to maintain that clean reputation weighed heavily on him. Unlike many of his contemporaries who embraced controversy, Cliff always felt the need to uphold an image of purity and grace. He once confessed in an interview, "People forget that I'm human. I make mistakes, I get tired, I get lonely, but they don't want to see that." Behind the scenes, Cliff began to struggle with isolation. Fame had trapped him in a cycle of performance and expectation. Every word he spoke, every move he made was scrutinized. Even his personal relationships became tabloid fodder. His commitment to his Christian faith made him an easy target for those who didn't understand his lifestyle choices. The same media that once praised him began to twist his image into something unrecognizable. Friends say that by the late 1980s, Cliff had begun to lose trust in the people around him. He had wealth, recognition, and success, but very few genuine connections. He was surrounded by people, yet always alone, one longtime associate recalled. He gave everything to his audience, but when the lights went out, he had nothing left for himself. Despite the growing emotional toll, Cliff kept performing. His tours continued to sell out, his albums continued to chart, and he maintained his signature smile. But those closest to him noticed a shift. The spark that once drove him seemed to fade. He began talking more about peace, solitude, and spirituality. His lyrics became introspective, almost mournful, as if he were searching for something beyond fame. By the time the 1990s arrived, Cliff had begun quietly pulling away from the public eye. He canceled several major appearances, spent long periods abroad, and even hinted in interviews that he might retire from music altogether. To many, it seemed unimaginable, Cliff Richard without the stage. But for him, it was the only way to find himself again. He had given everything to the world, and now, the world's noise had finally become too much to bear. As the 1990s unfolded, Cliff Richard's once brilliant career began to dim under the weight of exhaustion, loneliness, and relentless public pressure. For over 3 decades, he had carried the image of the perfect gentleman, a man who didn't drink, didn't smoke, and never caused trouble. But behind that carefully maintained facade was a person slowly breaking down. He had given so much of himself to his audience that he had nothing left to keep for his own peace of mind. Cliff had built his life around control, over his music, his reputation, and even his emotions. But the very thing that had protected him for years began to suffocate him. The constant demand to be flawless, both morally and artistically, made him feel trapped in an image he could no longer sustain. He once admitted, "You start to realize that people don't really see you. They see what they want you to be." Those words would soon prove hauntingly true. In 2014, Cliff Richard faced the most devastating chapter of his life. A sudden and shocking investigation into unproven allegations sent shockwaves through the entertainment industry. Though he was never arrested, never charged, and later fully cleared of any wrongdoing, the emotional and reputational damage was immense. The media frenzy was relentless. Helicopters hovered over his home. Reporters camped outside his door. And his name, once synonymous with music, became entangled in headlines of accusation and suspicion. For a man who had built his career on trust and faith, the betrayal of the public's perception was almost too much to endure. Friends described him as heartbroken and disillusioned. "It wasn't just about the false claims," one close friend said. "It was about how quickly people turned on him. He'd given them his life, and in an instant, they doubted everything." The incident marked a turning point. Cliff withdrew completely from the public eye, disappearing into a life of near-total silence. He stopped granting interviews, canceled appearances, and retreated to his homes in Portugal and Barbados. Those who knew him best said he was searching, not for fame, but for forgiveness, peace, and meaning in a world that had taken everything from him. During this period, Cliff began to focus deeply on his faith, leaning on spirituality as both a shield and a source of healing. He immersed himself in reading, prayer, and reflection. He also grew closer to a small circle of loyal friends who stood by him when the rest of the world turned away. He found comfort in simplicity, one of them recalled. The ocean, the quiet mornings, the sound of birds, those things brought him back to life. But even as he tried to heal, the scars of betrayal never fully faded. The sense of injustice lingered, and so did the feeling that his legacy had been unfairly tainted. Cliff once said in a rare interview, "You spend your whole life trying to do the right thing, and one lie can erase it all." Despite the pain, he refused to allow bitterness to consume him. In time, he began making small, cautious returns to music, not for fame, but for the love of the art that had once saved him. His later albums carried a different tone, quieter, more introspective, filled with lyrics about forgiveness and endurance. They weren't about chart success anymore. They were about healing through melody. For Cliff Richard, the world's admiration had come at a cost few could imagine. Fame had lifted him high, and then dropped him just as hard. The man who once sang the young ones was no longer young, and the industry that had once adored him had revealed its cruelty. By the end of that dark decade, one truth became clear. Cliff hadn't simply vanished. He had been broken and was learning, piece by piece, how to rebuild himself. After years of silence and reflection, Cliff Richard began to rediscover himself in ways that had nothing to do with fame, money, or recognition. He had spent decades chasing perfection in the eyes of the public. Now, he wanted only peace. Living between his homes in Portugal and Barbados, Cliff surrounded himself with tranquility, nature, and faith. It was a far cry from the flashing cameras and relentless schedules of his past, but it was exactly what his soul needed. Those close to him say that his mornings became sacred. He would wake early, walk along the ocean, and listen to music. Not his own, but songs that reminded him of why he fell in love with melody in the first place. Artists like Elvis Presley, Little Richard, and Nat King Cole still brought him joy, grounding him in a sense of nostalgia and gratitude. "He's not trying to be the world's favorite anymore," one longtime friend explained. "He's just trying to be himself." For a man who had spent over 60 years in the limelight, rediscovering simplicity was both strange and beautiful. He began to cook more, read more, and even tend to his garden. "I don't need the stage anymore," Cliff once said softly in a rare interview. "I need peace." Though his fans still adored him, Cliff made it clear that his days of touring the world and chasing chart toppers were behind him. Instead, he focused on smaller, more meaningful projects, music made from the heart, not the pressure of the industry. His songs during this period reflected themes of forgiveness, love, and the strength to let go. They were not hits in the commercial sense, but they resonated deeply with listeners who had followed his journey from stardom to solitude. Even as he retreated from public life, Cliff's impact remained undeniable. His records continued to sell, his Christmas specials replayed every year, and his legacy as one of Britain's greatest entertainers remained intact. But for Cliff, success no longer meant trophies or headlines. It meant being at peace with himself, something that had eluded him for most of his career. He often spoke about how fame could twist a person's perception of happiness. "You think you want applause," he said, "but what you really want is understanding." That understanding, he realized, could only come from within. He forgave those who had hurt him, the media, the doubters, even the fans who once believed the worst about him. Forgiveness became his greatest act of defiance. Despite his quiet life, there were still glimpses of the old Cliff, the warm smile, the charm, the humor that made millions fall in love with him. During a small event in London a few years ago, he told a fan, "Don't worry about me. I've had my turn in the sun. Now I'm just enjoying the sunset." Those words captured everything: acceptance, peace, and the realization that life after fame could be just as meaningful as life in it. While many stars of his generation struggled with aging and fading relevance, Cliff embraced it. He had no desire to compete with younger artists or reclaim the spotlight. He once said, "I've sung every song I needed to sing. The rest is just living." Now in his 80s, Cliff's life is a quiet reflection of resilience, a man who endured the harshest storms of celebrity and emerged stronger for it. His story is not one of downfall, but of rebirth. After all the chaos, all the heartache, and all the headlines, Cliff Richard finally found what he had been searching for all along: peace, purpose, and a life that belonged only to him. Even though Cliff Richard no longer dominates the charts like he once did, his presence still lingers across generations, not just through his music, but through the values he carried with him. Fans who grew up during the 1960s and 1970s often describe him as the soundtrack of their youth, a man whose songs symbolized hope, innocence, and faith in a world that was constantly changing. From Living Doll to We Don't Talk Anymore, each track seemed to tell a story of perseverance, reminding listeners that success didn't always require scandal or shock value. But after he stepped away from the spotlight, many assumed Cliff had quietly retired. The truth, however, is that he simply shifted his focus. Instead of chasing fame, he began devoting his time to introspection and faith. Living part-time in Portugal and Barbados, Cliff found peace away from the flashing cameras and critical headlines. He has spoken openly about cherishing the quiet, the simple act of waking up without pressure, enjoying the ocean breeze, and reflecting on a career that spanned over 6 decades. Behind closed doors, Cliff has also faced health scares, losing friends, and the constant reminder that fame is fleeting. Yet even in his most private struggles, he's remained gracious. He once said in an interview that, "Fame doesn't define who you are. It just amplifies what's already inside you." That humility is what separates him from so many of his peers. He never let bitterness take over, even after years of false accusations and media storms that could have destroyed anyone else. The darkest period of his life came when he was falsely accused of misconduct, allegations that later proved unfounded. The experience nearly shattered him. For years, he stayed out of the public eye, emotionally scarred by how quickly decades of goodwill could vanish overnight. When the truth finally cleared his name, Cliff didn't return with anger or revenge. Instead, he returned with forgiveness. He used the moment to speak about resilience, dignity, and faith in times of betrayal. His strength during that time turned him from just a pop icon into a symbol of endurance. As the years went by, fans began to notice something profound. Cliff Richard wasn't defined by his fame anymore. He had become something much deeper, a man who understood what it truly meant to let go. While others clung to the last threads of celebrity life, Cliff found meaning in letting the spotlight fade. He continued releasing music occasionally, but always on his terms. Albums like Rise Up and Music, The Air That I Breathe, were quiet testaments that his voice and his passion were still alive, even if his fame wasn't as loud. Today at 84, Cliff lives a life that many would envy. He remains close to his faith, grateful for the years he's been given, and still appreciative of the fans who never left his side. Occasionally, he appears in interviews or performs small concerts, smiling as if he's finally made peace with the world that once tried to break him. He's not chasing headlines anymore. He's simply living with grace. When asked recently if he misses fame, Cliff replied softly, "No, I don't miss it. Fame was wonderful, but peace is better." Those few words sum up his entire journey, from a teenage heartthrob to a living legend who finally found serenity in silence. In the end, Cliff Richard's story isn't about disappearance. It's about transformation. He didn't vanish, and he evolved. He walked away from the noise not because he had to, but because he was ready to. And in doing so, he reminded the world that even after the applause fades, a true artist's legacy continues to echo, softly but eternally.